speaking of people who have written some things of note, in the midst of a busy life of a senator, an even busier life as a presidential candidate, and an even busier life because of all the rulings and things going on, Ted Cruz found time to write a book, A Time for Truth, and it is out, and he is here. Senator, welcome. It's so nice to have you. How you doing?
Mark, good morning. It's always great to be with you.
Listen, we'll dive into the book here in a second, but first, the breaking headlines. You and I have not spoken since the Supreme Court rulings. Let's kind of go in chronological order. It's weird, isn't it, when a guy like John Roberts, who I think has noble and magnificent parts of his heart and his brain, we saw them in his magnificent, sublime rebuttal and objection to the Anthony Kennedy logic, and I use air quotes in that. The same guy a day before was dead wrong on Obamacare. How does that happen?
Well, I don't know how that happens, but I will say those two rulings on Thursday and Friday, within 24 hours, we saw a majority of the Supreme Court, the justices, violate their judicial oath. And it was a dark day, 2 days in a row. What we saw from the court was naked judicial activism, and what you just said a minute ago, it was lawlessness. On Thursday of last week, 6 justices rewrote the text of Obamacare. They got in, they took out their erasers and basically erased portions of federal law and rewrote it. And in doing so, they became partisan players, to use the analogy that John Roberts used at his confirmation hearing. They stopped being umpires calling balls and stripes, and they joined one of the teams. They pulled on jerseys with a bright blue O on it and joined the Obama administration in lawlessness. And the consequence of that is forcing this failed law on millions of Americans. Millions of Americans have lost their jobs, their health care, have seen their premiums skyrocket because of Obamacare. And then the next day, a majority of justices rewrote the Constitution, defied the law, and decreed from on high that all 50 states must adopt gay marriage. That was fundamentally illegitimate and lawless and wrong.
There's a judicial and constitutional argument, and then there's also pragmatic politics that directly affect you as a presidential candidate. What is the smartest, wisest thing for the GOP field to be doing and saying, and what's your plan moving forward?
Mark, I'm a big believer in the principle that good policy is good politics. And so I don't try to spend a whole lot of time studying polls or agonizing over focus groups before taking a position. What I try to do is honor the commitments that I made every day, and you and I spent a lot of time together on the campaign trail. Honor the commitments I made every day to 27 million Texans, to stand up and fight for them, to fight for our liberty, to fight for our Constitution. So in light of both of these rulings, I have pledged to fight them with every breath in my body. 2016, I believe now, is going to be a referendum on Obamacare, and any presidential candidate who isn't prepared to stand up and lead the fight to repeal every word of that failed law should get out of the way. And I think 2016 is also going to be a referendum and a religious liberty election that's going to be front and center. And I got to tell you, Mark, one of the saddest things watching the fallout from the rulings last week was just how many Republicans, including, sadly, a number of 2016 presidential candidates, ran for the hills, issued rulings, issued statements that essentially said, this is the law of the land, it's settled, we need to accept it and move on. Mark, there's something profoundly wrong when candidates for the Republican nomination for president are reading from Barack Obama's talking points, because those are his talking points.
So what does it look like to not let it go? What is the behavior and speech points of a candidate who says this is not the settled law of the land, we are not going to roll over?
Well, on marriage, I've introduced a constitutional amendment to protect the authority of the states to define marriage as the union of one man and one woman. Texans voted on it, and Texans voted overwhelmingly to retain the traditional definition of marriage. Secondly, in the United States Senate, I've introduced legislation that would strip the federal courts of jurisdiction over attacks on marriage. The Constitution gives authority over jurisdiction to Congress as a way of checking an overreaching judiciary. And third, in the wake of both of these rulings, I have called for another constitutional amendment, one that would subject the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court to periodic retention elections. 20 states have retention elections, and it is time to put a check to these lawless judges who are, as Justice Scalia powerfully said in dissent, posing a threat to our democracy. You know, Mark, one of the things that I talk about at great length in my new book, A Time for Truth, is what's going on behind the scenes in the decision-making in Washington. And I talk about the Supreme Court. As you know, I began my career as a law clerk for Chief Justice William Rehnquist at the Supreme Court. So I spent a great deal of time talking about what happens at the court, and then I spent north of a decade litigating in front of the Supreme Court. But I also try to shine a light on what happens behind closed doors in the United States Senate. And in particular, I tell the truth about what I call the Washington cartel, which is a coalition of career politicians, Democrats and Republicans, who get in bed with lobbyists and big business. And I try to shine the light on the corruption of Washington and the role of money in corrupting our politics.
Ted Cruz with us, Senator and presidential candidate. I'm writing down what you were saying about some of your replies to the gay marriage ruling. And everybody should notice this is not a constitutional amendment that you've proposed to define marriage the way we want it. It is merely a constitutional amendment that says that it's weird that we need a constitutional amendment to honor the Constitution as it already exists. It would essentially say the states get to settle this, not the whim of individual justices.
And that has been the Constitution since the very first day the Constitution was ratified. That has been from the beginning of this country. Marriage has been a question for the states. And what we saw on Friday was fundamentally illegitimate. You know, Justice Scalia in dissent referred to these are 5 unelected judges in robes, 5 unelected lawyers who have declared themselves the rulers of 320 million Americans. And how fundamentally undemocratic. Look, if a particular individual in Texas or elsewhere supports gay marriage as a policy position, I don't agree with that. I am a strong supporter of traditional marriage, but people can differ on this issue. Under the Constitution, there is an avenue for advancing your different policy perspective, which is convincing your fellow citizens to change the laws in your state legislature. That's the way our Constitution works. What we saw last week is liberal elites don't care what the American people believe. Liberal elites don't care that the people of Texas voted to protect traditional marriage that follows a biblical definition. Instead, they have decreed on high the views of the American people don't matter, and that is profoundly illegitimate.
And that was the third thing you mentioned about retention elections. You mentioned 20 states have retention elections. These are for judges in states where judges are elected, right?
In some instances, they're elected. In other instances, they're appointed, and then they appear on the ballot for retention elections.
Gotcha.
So we've seen, for example, California.
Mm-hmm.
In 1986, the California people threw out Supreme Court justices who repeatedly had refused to follow their capital punishment law. And the people of California said, follow the law.
Aren't we? I love that if we have clarity. I'm working with the retention election thing because the appointed for life Supreme Court justice has always been a dicey thing to me. But aren't we scared about some future Antonin Scalia getting yanked by a country gone crazy?
You know, if we look at the practice of how retention elections have operated across the country in 20 states where they've happened, the people have not used them willy-nilly. They've used them in egregious cases. So the 3 instances, you've got California in 86, you've got Nebraska, where a judge was thrown out who had refused to enforce the state's term limits ban. And then in Iowa in 2010, 3 justices did exactly what the Supreme Court justices did on Friday, decreed gay marriage contrary to the state's constitution. And the people of Iowa, who I would note, Iowa is traditionally a purple state. It has gone both Republican and Democrat. The people of Iowa threw out 3 Supreme Court justices who committed the same lawless act that the Supreme Court did on Friday. The American people are a judicious people. We're a cautious people. And if the Supreme Court is going to assume for itself, seize the power to resolve policy issues that are left to the people, we've got to have a structural constraint to rein in their lawlessness, because sadly, Congress isn't doing it. And you know, Mark, one of the things that I pointed out, the Washington cartel is celebrating these decisions. There are a lot of Republicans in Washington who have issued a statement criticizing them, but they're quietly popping champagne. And the reason is they agree. There are far too many career politicians in Washington who agree with these decisions, who are thrilled that Congress now is not going to deal with Obamacare, who are thrilled not to have to defend marriage anymore because they're listening to the elites in Manhattan and Washington, D.C. that disagree with the Judeo-Christian values and the constitutional liberties of this country. And that's what the book, A Time to Truth, really tries to focus on, is helping let men and women into what's happening behind closed doors in Washington. So I would encourage your listeners, if you want to see what's really going on, if you understand there's a corruption in Washington, you want to know what's going on, I would encourage you to read the book. I think it'll give people a good insight into what's happening.
And it is called A Time for Truth. Listen, a lot of people in politics write books. A lot of people running for president write books. But in Ted Cruz's book, not just the ideology that we've talked about a lot, but behind the scenes at the Supreme Court and the Senate. And I much appreciate you, sir. Thanks for the time today. I know we'll be talking a lot, and I thank you every time we do. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, my friend. God bless you. And I will mention, by the way, in the last 3 months, the energy and enthusiasm we've seen on the presidential campaign. Over 100,000 people have gone to tedcruz.org, have contributed, have supported the campaign. And I think people are ready for meaningful change. Courageous conservatives are rising up. And, Mark, I thank you for what you're doing to encourage courageous conservatives each and every day. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you, man. You bet. Talk to you soon. Ted Cruz, A Time for Truth, and tedcruz.org.